Hi students, welcome back. Coming to the next topic in the subject operating system is what is kernel. In the previous video, I discussed about the definition of the operating system and the importance of operating system, the features of the operating system. There we came across the word kernel. So now let's have a look on what exactly the kernel before going to the further topics in the operating system, right? So in this video, I'm going to explain the different types of kernels, monolithic kernel, and the microkernel. So these are the two different types. Actually, so many types of kernels are there, but the most used kernels are the monolithic kernel and the microkernel. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover in this video. Okay, now coming to what is a kernel. Actually, a kernel is a central component of computer operating system. Everyone is getting a doubt. Is it kernel is a hardware component or is a software component? Actually, this is a software component, a piece of software which is interacting with directly hardware parts. Okay, so that I'll explain within the diagram. Don't worry about it. But let's get a clarity on that. A kernel is a central component of a computer operating system. In the computer operating system, this kernel is one of the most important and the central component. Actually, the only job performed by the kernel is what it is doing. It is managing the communication between the software and the hardware. So here the kernel is there. The kernel is managing the communication between the hardware as well as the software. So then you will get a doubt. We are talking that the kernel is a software, then it is acting as a communication between the software and the hardware. Right, whatever you're hearing is it's right. So the kernel actually it's a language that is easily understandable to the hardware parts. If you take like the high level language, whatever we are working on the C and whatever the language that the user is able to understand, so that language is a high level language that you can also, it is a software, right? But these language directly can't understand by the hardware. So internally, some softwares are there that are useful to convert the user program into the machine understandable program, right or wrong? Okay, so that is a one thing. So here the kernel is also a piece of software that is used to get a communication between the user programs and that is a user softwares, a system softwares to the hardware parts. So a kernel is at a nucleus of a computer. It makes the communication between the hardware and the software possible. Because of this kernel software piece of software only, a communication is established and between the hardware and the software. That is what I said. While the kernel is a innermost part of operating system, a shell is the outermost one. Then what about this shell? I said the kernel is one of the important component and it is acting a communication between user hardware and the software. Okay, but coming to the this shell, a shell is the outermost one, whereas kernel is the innermost one. Suppose let's take operating system, right? So in the operating system, the innermost part is the kernel we are talking it, and the outermost shell you call part you call it as a shell. That means this shell is directly interacting with the user program and kernel is interacting with directly to the hardware. Suppose if you are taking an operating system is also an interaction, is a software which acts as an interface between the software and the hardware. That you know that, right? In the operating system, you are having the shell and the kernel. So the shell is directly interacting with the software, whereas kernel is the innermost part of the operating system which directly interact with the hardware. Now you will get an idea, right? Okay, don't get confused. Shell is the outermost one which is communicating direct to the user's programs, and the kernel is the innermost part of the operating system which is directly communicating with the hardware parts, right? So if you see this diagram here, this is a user, right? So, and this is the terminals like the system softwares, all this will be there in this terminals, and the application programs all will be present. So here this will be communicating directly with the shell. So which is the outermost part, okay, outermost part of the operating system. And whereas a kernel is the innermost part of the operating system. So what the role of the kernel is doing? It is directly interacting with the hardware parts, whereas shell is directly interacting with the user program. Now, coming to the features of the kernel. So the kernel features is, it is a low level scheduling of process, inter-process communication. Actually, this is a low level scheduling of process. So whatever the operating system, it means the commands giving by the user, so the kernel is scheduling in a way that, and it can directly interacting with the hardware. So this is a low level scheduling of process, and it is also doing that inter-process communication, right or wrong, it is doing a part of a communication job. So an inter-process communication is establishing with the help of this kernel, and it is also doing the process synchronization. Whatever the process that the multiple processor coming, that will be synchronized by the kernel. And some context switching job is there. Context switching is nothing but whenever the higher priority job is coming, this process has to need to be hold, and the another process is the whatever the highest priority is there, that has to be interacted with the hardware parts. So that role is also performed by the kernel. Now coming to the different types of the kernel. Okay. So I think you will get a clear picture of the kernel and the shell. Now let's see the different types of the kernel. Based on the user's requirement, they can select, they can install a different types of a kernel. So there are many types of kernels that exist. Among them, the two most popular kernels are the monolithic kernel and the microkernel. Now first let's have a look on the monolithic kernel. A monolithic kernel is a single code or a block of a program. That means it is only a single code, a complete code, or you can simply call it as a block of program. A block of program. In that block of program, all the operations, all the functions, everything will be there. So this is a monolithic kernel. So it is a software, a piece of software which is directly interacting with the hardware parts. But this monolithic kernel is consisting of a block of program. It provides all the required service offered by the operating system. Okay, there is no drawback here. It is also providing all the required services that are offered by the operating system. So it is a simplistic design which creates a distinct communication layer between the hardware and the software. So remember student, the monolithic is a simplistic design. Why I'm calling it as a simplistic design? Because everything it's in is a present inside the single block of code. But one disadvantage is there. What is the disadvantage? Obviously, a code of is should be a very big, right or wrong? If you want to do some modification, means the user system programmer has to need do some modifications. He has to check with the complete block of the program. So that is a disadvantage. But it is a simplistic design which creates a distinct communication layer between the hardware and software. Now coming to the microkernels. What about this microkernel? A microkernel manages all systems resources. So, whereas the previously whatever I said, the monolithic kernel is a single which offer the whatever the services required, okay, offered by the operating system is provided in the monolithic kernel. So in the same way, the microkernel manages all the system resources. So it is also managing the all the system resources. So in this type of kernel, services are implemented in different address space. Okay, so here whatever the services that this microkernel is providing are implemented in different address spaces. So the user services are stored in user address space, and the kernel services are stored in kernel address space. So this is the main difference between the monolithic kernel and microkernel. Okay, so here the complete address space is divided into two parts. Okay, the user address space and the kernel address space. So based on the user's request, the user address space user's program is going to be accessed. It means it is not a single block of code. It is divided into users as well as the kernels. So it helps to reduce the size of both the kernel and the operating system. So the main advantage in this microkernel is it is more stable. Remember student, it is more stable. What is this? This is an advantage of the microkernel. Then what about the disadvantage? If there is an advantage, something its disadvantage is also there. So what is it? There are lots of system calls and the context switchings will be there. Okay, there are lots of system calls and context switching is there. in microkernel. So this is a disadvantage, remember. Okay, so these are the two different types of the kernel, mostly used type of the kernels. Actually, still there are like hybrid kernel is there. Okay, hybrid kernel and exokernel, and still nano kernel. So these are all the different types of the kernels, okay, which are used interacting with the hardware parts, and it is an innermost part of the operating system. So hybrid kernel is nothing but, I'm just giving an overview, student. Hybrid kernel, it's nothing but it's a combination of both. It's a combination of both monolithic kernel. So whatever I discussed now, the monolithic kernel plus microkernel. So that's why I'm calling it as a hybrid kernel. Hybrid kernel having the features of the monolithic as well as a microkernel. So obviously, if it is having the features of both, means it uses speed of monolithic and the modularity of the micro. It will take all the advantages there, and this hybrid kernel is designed. And coming to the nano kernel, so nano kernel is a whole code of kernel is a very small. Remember, student, the whole code of program is code of kernel is very small. The name implies is saying that it is a nano. Nano means it's a small, right? A whole code of the kernel is a very small. So it supports a nano clock resolution, nanoseconds clock resolutions. So these are the different types of the kernel, students. So when we are talking about the microkernel, so in a monolithic kernel, a software kernel and the hardware will be there. And whereas in the microkernel, some interprocess communication is established. So, and it has a virtual memory, and the thread scheduling is there in the microkernel, and it is more stable with less services in kernel space. Okay, so I hope you understand what exactly the kernel is. And the different types of the kernels. So in the next video, we will discuss about